Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Dr. Joyce Gomez, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Literacy and Reading Education at California State University, Fullerton. Um, Today, we're going to be exploring identity-centered assessment and instruction as a means of enhancing student engagement in literacy and reading instruction. I have a bit.ly here that I'm going to go ahead and share with you all in the chat so that you can access the slides as well. Hi, good morning, welcome. I'm going to share it one more time because I see we have someone who joined us just now. Perfect. All right. So if you could give me like a thumbs up or something to let me know if you're able to access. Perfect. Thank you so much, Julie. Appreciate it. All right. So a little bit about myself. As I mentioned, I'm an associate professor in the Department of Literacy and Reading Education. I was actually born and raised here in Southern California, although I did have the privilege of serving as an elementary school teacher and literacy specialist for the Clark County School District for several years. So that's in Las Vegas, Nevada. So that was a really fun experience. But I'm happy to be back here in Southern California. Actually completed my teaching credential here at Cal State Fullerton a while ago. So it's nice to be back in a professor capacity and to just be part of this community again. I'm also a mom. I have two daughters. Olivia is 8 and Odette is 4. So my research is includes exploring social justice and teacher education and exploring culturally responsive and sustaining approaches to assessment and instruction, often in the context of assessment models such as RTI or MTSS. And I really look forward to learning more about you all in our short time together. We have, as I mentioned, a nice little intimate group, so that's lovely. So I'm going to go ahead and also share a bit.ly here. You can also use your phone to hold up against the screen and scan the QR code. So I'll give you a sec to do that if that's the option you choose to use. And then I'll put the bit.ly in the chat as well in a sec. But what I'm going to invite folks to do is to share a teaching celebration from your experience this past year. And there'll be a few more directions posted here as well. So let me just put this in the chat real quick. So yeah, we always want to just celebrate all the work that you all do. So feel free to share your name, your teaching context, so we can learn a little bit more about you. And again, one celebration from your teaching just this new academic year. So for me, again, here's my name and my teaching context. And one thing I wanted to celebrate was the opportunity to connect with families during clinical experiences, either face to face or via Zoom. That's been a privilege for me. Go ahead and share some of your thoughts in the Padlet. I'll also go back to the slide in case you want to scan the QR code. Awesome. Thank you for sharing, Rachel. Oh, yay. That's a wonderful celebration, Julie. It's awesome to connect with families. So since we have such a small group too, I'm wondering if folks are comfortable, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and maybe share a little bit about what it is you like have questions about in relation to student engagement. Like what were some of the things that maybe prompted you to join this session this morning? Oh, go for it, Julie. Thank you.
Well, like I said, I'm a new teacher, and I teach in an elementary school, which is a change because I came from high school.
Mm,
And I'm an SAI teacher, so I pull kids out all day into my room.
mm,
And a lot of my kids this year, they are ELL, which I've never really taught before. And a lot of them are, fourth and fifth graders that are still reading at a pre-primer or
mm,
first grade level.
mhm,
So for me, it's just trying, I only get an hour a day with them, or sometimes only 30 minutes. Like,
mhm,
how can I make the most impact with them? And by the way, I'm a special ed teacher.
mhm.
So how can I make the most impact with them in my 30 minutes or an hour a day to really help them, bring their literacy up to where they can feel confident and comfortable in their fifth grade class or fourth grade class, reading still at a first grade level or even preschool level.
Those are important questions. Thank you, Julie, for sharing that. I'm going to make an effort to really connect to some of those questions as we engage in some of the material this morning. Does anyone
Hi
else
there.
want to share?
Can
Hi.
I add to that? Sorry. Also, I apologize. This is my natural voice.
Oh, there's no apologies
You're
necessary.
probably
Hi,
like,
Rachel.
what is going on?
No, I
Uh,
sound like Lisa Simpson, so it's just
oh
like
my God.
we just
You're like,
we
are,
celebrate the voices we have, right?
you're like, are you okay? Here, I'll start my video. So I teach at a Title I school with a lot of ELs.
Mhm.
So Julie, when you were talking about like having lots of students who are like 2 or 3 grade levels below like grade level, that's something that I experience a lot. And I do have a lot of like very hesitant readers and like very discouraged readers too, and just students who have like other life experiences that affected their access to reading growing up.
Mhm.
So I feel like I am trying to build like that emotional and like intrinsic buy-in to start reading rather than like the extrinsic like frustration where they just feel like, oh, I have to do this because it's school. So I think that's like my goal for the school year is to like get kids to want to read.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Rachel. I think that passion for lifelong learning is something that a lot of educators obviously hold and are committed to. And we just want to share that with our kiddos, right? We want them to flourish and to love learning and to love the journey. Thank you for sharing. So no pressure, but if anyone else wants to share, you're welcome to.
Hi, I am not teacher, but I am instructional designer. I am building learning tools for all ages.
Oh,
And
wow.
I work with elementary school kids and I have kindergartner. I look forward to learning from you.
Thank you so much. Oh, I'm so excited that you're here and we get to talk about curriculum too. Awesome. Well, so this kind of the same way we all are either in my case talking about this topic or in your case like joining to talk more about this topic in today's session. There's relevance at the heart of our meeting today, right? There's something personally meaningful and reflective of our own either inquiries or questions or experiences that draws us to this topic today. And so I want to emphasize that element of the instructional process, of the assessment process, because it's integral to the work that we do with students in relation to building engagement. So we're going to talk today about how we can draw from students intersecting social identities and experiences as a way to launch or anchor our instructional and assessment considerations? How do we honor those experiences? How do we draw from them and integrate them into our instructional and pedagogical considerations? So we're going to talk about two things specifically today. First, we're going to talk about the use of authentic text. And secondly, we're going to talk about diverse forms of assessment that help us learn more about students' areas of strength as well as need. So how do we build these authentic opportunities that allow us to explore those funds of knowledge and to illuminate them and to draw from them in our instructional practices? So some of this work is informed, if not inspired, by the work of Goldie Muhammad, who talks about cultivating genius in her students. And in the discussion of identity, she argues that identity is fluid, it's multi-layered, and it's relational. It's also shaped by the social and cultural environment, as well as our literacy practices. So in that sense, there's some reciprocity between the literacy experiences that students are engaged in the classroom, but also the experiences that they're bringing to the classroom from their households, from their communities, and with that also their identities. So some of the experiences and identities that folks shared earlier included identities as emerging bilingual or multilingual kiddos, experiences in terms of socioeconomic status or other life experience, such as maybe experiencing foster care or the adoption process or divorce. All of these are experiences that really shape the meaning making that our students make and the ways in which they engage with the content, the curriculum, the literacy experiences they're having in our classroom. So it's important to recognize that and to draw from that as we develop our instructional practices. So again, the experiences they're having with us are meaningful and they're thereby engaging. So it's important that students see themselves in their learning and that we invite, in a very intentional way, students to share their own perspectives and their own experiences. So one example would be the tell our name stories. So this could be an instance where you share your name and share with folks what is it about the origins of your name. So for instance, I know that my first name is Joyce, and it came from my parents' fascination with Joyce DeWitt from Three's Company show, or at least the appreciation for the name, right? So that's part of my story. Does anyone else want to share a story related to their name? No pressure, but okay, no pressure. But that would be an example of an opportunity for students to really showcase a little bit about themselves. You can also create digital stories, especially in these times where we're exploring the affordances of Zoom and other tech resources. And then with that process also, we're called to unpack our personal biases and assumptions. So we want to consider the ways in which our social identities and experiences maybe align with those of our students, but also ways in which they don't align with our students. And we have to really examine what that means for the instructional practices that we're taking. So as an example, when I was a first year teacher, I resonated with a lot of my students' experiences as being part of the Latinx community, as someone who identifies as a woman. I also, resonated with experiences of young girls and what that looked like. But I also brought with me this commitment to yes, sí se puede, anything is possible. You can go to college. But also with that, I realized was also a bit of a chip on my shoulder. If I can do it, you can do it, without also recognizing the privilege that I was, the elements of my identity that also were privileged, such as in terms of documentation and just the privilege of being born in this country at this particular time. And without interrogating some of the privileges that came with my elements of my identity that maybe didn't resonate with some of those of my students, I didn't allow myself to recognize some of the additional obstacles that they had to navigate in their own households or experiences as they were also working toward their academic and learning goals. So yes, sí se puede for sure. That's definitely something I still believe, but I also had to recognize the ways in which my privilege might foster some bias that I had toward experiences that were not shared. So as part of that process of learning more about our student identities and how we want to incorporate that into our instruction, we have to be very intentional about thinking about that, asking questions, doing research, and being very careful before we start facilitating those types of conversations. So I would want to learn more about those experiences that were not shared, as part of the process of learning, or as part of the process of selecting, for example, books that reflect the experiences that some of my students might have that, again, didn't resonate with my own personal experiences. And so here is where the work of like Kimberly Crenshaw, who explored intersectionality, can be very helpful, because when we think about our social identities, they're really quite complex. So when I think about just my own personal identity, there is, of course, my race and culture, the languages I speak, socioeconomic status, but there's so much more too, right? There's sexual orientation, gender identity, nationality, religion, faith. All of those also have shaped the ways in which I view the world and engage with literacy. And they also are part of the areas that I need to interrogate too, especially if I have an experience that's different from those of my students. So we also have to recognize that it's difficult to compartmentalize these areas sometimes. So like if we're thinking about like ability and language, like there are two different areas in which we're considering as we plan instruction, right? We're thinking about accommodations, but we're also thinking about the development of English language proficiency specifically, while also fostering the home language. So it's a very complex work. So sometimes we might foreground some of these identities, like in an IEP, maybe we're talking about like what accommodations are necessary for a particular disability. But at the same time, if we know that the student's an emerging bilingual learner, we're also thinking about what that means as well. Like how are we using sentence frames? How are we including lots of visuals? Like we have to pull from all of these understandings in order to develop a plan that's specifically meeting the needs of individual learners, and really pushing back on a one-size-fits-all frame or an essentializing framework that might assume that everybody from this group learns the same way. And so one important element of that is selecting authentic text for instruction. And I also want to preface this by saying that when we're selecting text at a tier 1 level, we're also considering these other multifaceted structures that need to be in place. So when we think about one-on-one instruction, of course, it's a little easier to think about like what specifically is going to serve the needs of this individual student. But if we're in an elementary school context where we're serving 30 students, or middle school or high school context where we're serving 30 students times 5 periods, that's a lot of kiddos, right? So we have to have some of these structures in place to ensure that we have the most solid tier 1 instruction possible. So these include balanced literacy approaches where we're providing students with opportunities to engage in guided reading, shared reading. We're modeling some of these strategies. We're also giving them similarly opportunities to engage in shared writing, guided writing, independent writing. We're giving them intentional feedback. We're also incorporating goals toward listening and speaking and providing the proper scaffolds in that respect as well. And for students who have difficulty accessing grade level text, as some of us mentioned earlier, we are also considering possible word study practices. But if we're talking about a middle school or high school context, we also have to select instructional approaches that are relevant to the individual students and their, something that's age appropriate. So whereas like in first or second grade, you might have some of those like colorful alphabet letters and stuff that you get to manipulate, and there's like the puppets and the songs. In high school or middle school, you might think more about like sentence strips that you're cutting, or slate work, or quick index cards, and then also following up with text that reflects some of those word patterns that you're working toward. And it can be a very meaningful text. It could be a song lyrics, it could be poetry that reflects some of those word patterns, so students can see that practice, so they don't have to read like level text like the rat sat on a mat, right? We want to make sure that it's engaging for the student. So when we're thinking about a broader classroom context, we want to make sure that we have some UDL structures in place where we're providing students with multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. So what that means is our instructional options are multifaceted. So you're providing students with opportunities to engage with the material, either through the use of technology, or through art, or through hands-on experiences, or through music. You also similarly allow them to express their understanding of the content through some of these different approaches as well. So differentiated instruction is essential, and also culturally responsive and sustaining materials that reflect the students' experiences. So you can certainly have some whole group lessons where you have some shared materials, but you can also create small group experiences or choice opportunities for students to select materials that are meaningful for them. So some of these structures just really need to be in place in a tier 1 context, but also if we're working with students one-on-one, or if we're working with students in small groups, we're also considering how we can differentiate some of our approaches based on what we know about them, based on what we know works for them, based on what we know is relevant to them and their experiences. And so I want to talk a little bit about the importance of curriculum and the importance of materials that reflect students' identities. And so some research that came out of the CCBC, which is a children's book center, looked at the books that had been published just in the year 2017. And what they found was that there was like disproportionate representations of different cultural groups or identities in some of the picture books that were available. So we love books that reflect animals, right? Of course, a lot of really wonderful stories have all these like animated animal characters, which is lovely, but we also want to be mindful of the proportions in which different students' cultural identities or just intersecting identities are also reflected in those texts. So what the CCBC found was that picture books were 4 times more likely to represent a dinosaur than a child of Native American heritage, and 2 times more likely to represent a rabbit than a child of Asian Pacific heritage. So again, this is not to discredit the representation of dinosaurs in the books that our students might see, but it also calls to attention the rate at which we're representing students' personal experiences and their cultural heritage and other elements of their identity. So this is just another visual that kind of illustrates this idea. So we do need to take a look, like an inventory, if you will, of the materials that we plan to use, the curriculum we plan to design or co-construct, and consider the extent to which we're representing students' cultural backgrounds, but also, as I mentioned, linguistic experiences, socioeconomic experiences, all of the experiences that you know are prevalent in that school community. To what extent do some of their narratives also get reflected in the content in which they're engaged with? How could we enhance engagement through material that's relevant to students' lives and experiences and questions? Similarly, well, just as important as representing cultural groups is the ways in which those representations are delivered. So what I want to talk about also in conjunction with this conversation about books is how we refine our critical lenses as we make these selections. So I'm going to share like a little snippet of book. So Skippy John Jones was like a really popular series. So Skippy John Jones is a Siamese cat. And so this is one book. And so we're going to talk a little bit about who's represented in the book, how are they represented, and what messages are delivered through this text. So I'm just going to play a little bit of this story. And we'll And I'm going to narrate a little bit just for time. So just to set up the book, Skippy John Jones is kind of exploring his own identity. And he's like, I don't know if I'm a Siamese cat. Maybe I'm something else.
Then, using his very best Spanish accent, he said, "Ears are too big for my head. My head is too big for my body. I am not a Siamese cat. I am a Chihuahua." Back on land, Skippy John Jones climbed into his toy box, rifled through some of his old junk. After he put on his mask and sword and climbed onto his mouse, Skippy John Jones began to sing in a moving style. Papito Francisco, I fear not a single bandito. My manners are mellow. I'm sweet like the jello. I get the job done, yes indeedo.
I'm going to fast forward a little bit to share some of the, like, where his imagination takes him.
Then the smallest of the small ones spoke up. Asked the people. Go incognito, said Scipio.
Oh.
Do you like rice and beans? Asked Pinolito. Sing! I love mice and beans, said Scapito. He might be the dog of our dreams, whispered Rosalita. Oh, perhaps, said Tia Mia, if he knows the secret password.
Okay, thank you for the note about the volume. Okay, so what are some of your thoughts? Who do you see? And some of these questions come from critical literacy, so we could also invite our students to critically evaluate text, not necessarily about cultural representations, but about messages in general. But who do we see represented in the book, and how do you see them represented? What are some of your thoughts in response to some of these questions?
The only part that I heard, 'cause
sorry.
it was hard to hear,
Oh, sorry.
was about being a Chihuahua. Is that what he
Oh,
was saying? He was being a
yes,
Chihuahua?
he was saying he was being a Chihuahua, yeah.
But it sounded like the voice was maybe Latin American voice,
Yeah, like
possibly.
yes, like in an exaggerated accent, right?
Yes. Seemed like it was an exaggerated accent. So I don't know. I couldn't hear most of it. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Let me go ahead. Were you all able to hear it after I put the volume up a bit? Okay, all
I
right.
could hear it right after you put the volume up. I could hear it.
Okay. Well, I'll go ahead for the sake of time. We'll kind of talk through some of the ideas. So some of the pieces of dialogue that came out were about like the characters liking rice and beans and like some other stereotypical representations of a Latinx community, right? And so when we think about the selection of text, we also want to like problematize any potential stereotypes that might be represented through a particular text or any other form of media, right? So in addition to selecting books or materials or song lyrics that we feel will represent diverse experiences. We also want to be mindful of the ways in which they're represented to ensure that they're authentically representing the experiences of our students, as opposed to like deficit oriented or the stereotypical representations, especially if we're working with younger students who might like internalize some of these messages as well. So we want to think about what kind of experiences we're fostering with our students in the classroom, because it can be very challenging, of course, to enhance engagement if students are experiencing these microaggressions or other negative experiences through the curriculum or through engagement with some of the curricular materials. So with this in mind, I also included some resources that I hope are helpful. They include websites to different spaces that showcase diverse forms of text. In addition, here is a culturally responsive curriculum scorecard that comes out of NYU that you can use to critically evaluate the curriculum at your school site or in your school district. So kind of, again, with all of this in mind, thinking about how we can apply critical lenses to the selection of the materials that we use. So in addition to trying to represent students' experiences, also engaging in that research and interrogating our biases and making sure we're representing them well and facilitating really fruitful conversations and reducing harm as much as possible. So also kind of with the idea that instruction, like setting students up for instructional experiences that represent their identities, we have to also have assessment practices that allow us to illuminate those areas of strength and those interests. So assessment is really a key part of informing the work that we do. So when we see that students are several grade levels behind, we need assessment to have a better understanding of why that might be the case. So for instance, if we notice that they're having difficulty reading the text with fluency, then that is going to impact their comprehension, right? So it might become immediately apparent at the comprehension level. They take a benchmark and we see that their score was like 30%, and that's something that kind of comes to our attention, but then we have to dig deeper. Okay, well, they're not able to read with enough fluency to allow them to focus on the content of the text. Well, why aren't they able to read with fluency? Oh, they have difficulty decoding multisyllabic words. So we need to use different assessments that help us break down those skills in reading so that we could see what we need to target within that particular intervention space or one-on-one space, whether we're working with a student for 15 minutes or we're initiating a small group learning experience with a group of students who have similar areas of need. But with that in mind, we also want to, in addition to identifying areas that students need work in. Oh yes, you can, I shared the bit.ly for the slides, but I'll share it again at the end so that you can access all of these resources. They should be, you should be able to click on them and find them in the slides. Yeah, thank you for your question. So we need to be able to use assessment to identify those areas of need, but we also want to be able to identify the areas of strength and how we might draw from assessment, identity to develop interventions or targeted instructional sessions that really are meaningful for those individual students. So our assessments also need to be culturally and developmentally appropriate, aligned with instructional objectives, and drawn from real reading and writing tasks. So I'll share some examples in a bit, but I also want to invite folks to interrupt the use of deficit language and perspectives when we engage in that process. So even like as someone who engages with scholarship and literacy and reading, I often come across some of this language just even in peer-reviewed articles or books, the use of like the word deficit, or the use of the word or the label struggling readers, or the idea that we're giving students language, which of course comes with the assumption that English is the language that we need to prioritize as opposed to fostering multiple languages. And so we want to kind of push back on that, because if we take that deficit approach, we're privileging certain pieces of information or perspectives, right? And we want to consider how that might impact the engagement that we have in our students, right? If they're experiencing like microaggressions, or they're feeling less than through these experiences or through this vocabulary, then they might be less inclined, of course, to participate and engage with the learning units or lessons that we've developed. So we want to be very mindful of the ways in which we can build up our students and celebrate all of the strengths and the knowledge that our students are bringing from their households, from their communities. So we want to develop asset-based approaches to instruction. This includes using person-first language. So if you have a student with autism, then we want to structure our language in such a way, right? Because we're not essentializing students based on different abilities or things like that. Similarly, if they're we have students who are in the emerging bilingual learning process, that similarly we're recognizing that being like an English language learner isn't their identity, right? So we're celebrating and affirming the knowledge that they're bringing to the classroom already. And so through that, we can engage in formative and summative assessment practices that allow us to better understand what's going to be meaningful for those particular students, those particular learners. And as much as we can develop authentic performance-based assessments that will allow us to kind of showcase some of the skills that they're bringing already from their households. So I have 4 examples here that we could talk about a bit. So the first is photo centers reflecting school community. And these are really meant to just kind of showcase the ways in which we can utilize assessment that allows us to learn more about students learning in their communities. So Lamont and Henderson did a project in which the researchers took photos of the surrounding school community. And then what they did during activities was they invited students to engage in written conversations in response to the photos. So they'd rotate these different photos from their community, and they'd ask them questions like, how'd the photo make you feel? What was it in the photo that made you feel that way? And so in that article, they talk about how kids would be really excited, like, oh, that's my uncle's truck. Like they would find pieces of their own experiences reflected in these materials, and that would prompt engagement because it was meaningful, personally meaningful for them. But at the same time, the researchers and the teachers were able to see students' writing flourish. And in that way, they had a better understanding of some of those like more skill-based elements of the writing process. And that it was reflective of what they're like fully capable of, as opposed to giving them like a standard decontextualized prompt, right? So in this way, they were able to draw from the students' personal experiences to enhance engagement and to get a better, more authentic window into some of their learning and thinking around literacy and reading. And then kind of from that, students also started applying that critical lens to their own classroom, and they noticed like, hey, we don't often see ABC books that represent like our experiences or our communities. So they then use the photos to create their own ABC class book, which I thought was kind of cool. Another example comes out of the work of Lopez and colleagues, and it's called Project Recuerdo. So what this team did was they thought more about the ways in which Latinx families were like the language and knowledge that they brought was valued, or in this case devalued, in the school community, and they wanted to dismantle that. They wanted to interrupt that a little bit. And they saw those deficit perspectives as a potential barrier for ongoing family engagement. And so they wanted to interrupt that and instead draw from families' funds of knowledge, community cultural wealth, and utilize culturally sustaining pedagogy to showcase some of the literacy knowledge that was prevalent in the community. So what they did was they co-constructed curricular experiences that allowed them, again, to showcase some of that knowledge. So for instance, here you see some ofrendas that the students were able to develop during those fall months. So that aligns with Dia de los Muertos celebrations. And specifically what they had students write about was they invited the students to write about a family member that they had lost, but through their perspective. So here you can see that the student wrote about their grandmother and shared insight to their grandmother through the grandmother's perspective, and you can see it was in Spanish. So these are some of the ways that they were able to even just like visually see and learn more about students' lives and experiences and understandings of literacy. So just walking through the halls, families could, or educators could learn more about families, and even students themselves could learn about one another and have those shared experiences. So through these authentic cultural experiences, they were also able to see like this flourishing of writing capabilities, right? So again, you could juxtapose that to like a decontextualized passage that you print out from teacher created materials, right? Like, so those resources are there, but if we can also explore ways that are pedagogical approaches and instructional methods that are really closely aligned to the experiences of our students in our school community, you could see how that would be much more authentic and much more accurate a view of what students know and are excited about. Another important consideration is translanguaging. And so in this article, the authors talk about just the importance of creating spaces for students to draw from their multiple languages or their language knowledge as a way to, again, increase engagement, but also relevance, and to co-construct meaning. So you kind of saw that in the example earlier, where the student was able to share their knowledge in Spanish, creating spaces for students to speak in multiple languages or to write in multiple languages or read in multiple languages, even beyond like a dual immersion context, allowing students to kind of flourish in those literacies simultaneously and to really showcase their understanding of literacy practices beyond just the context of English. And so similarly, I'll have the links to other books, like bilingual books, that you can use if you're interested in exploring some of those resources, but also thinking about, in terms of instruction, space for authentic stories with authentic language. So again, here you can see an example of a student sharing about an experience where they went to another country to attend a funeral, and how that experience shaped her, or how like she reacted to that experience. You could see it represented in English as well as Spanish. And then finally, the fourth example I wanted to share was intertextual analysis. And in this particular study, Kim and Covino talk about the analysis of writing to understand like what context students' writing tends to thrive. So here they notice, for instance, in this particular writing sample, or with this particular student, Jay, his writing flourished whenever he had the opportunity to write about social experiences that he'd had. So here you can see he's writing about him and his friend engaging in some pretend play surrounding Star Wars. So he's Luke Skywalker, I'm Darth Maul. And so they noticed that with this particular student, his writing skills were better showcased when he was able to write about topics, about some of those social experiences, those friendships that he had. So gaining insight to the ways in which, or the context in which students thrive, allow us to, again, enhance engagement, but also for us to like better understand the true strengths and skills that our students are bringing to the classroom with them. So these assessment measures or approaches can be both formal as well as informal. So we certainly have our more formal, like we have our standard measures, and I'll talk a bit more about like the use of screeners and things like that. But we can also couple that with some more informal assessment measures, such as running records or anecdotal records or teacher observations, interviews with parents, like interview surveys or interviews with students themselves. The motivation to read profiles, just one example of an assessment you could use to learn more about how students feel about reading and how students feel about themselves as readers. So if we recognize that students grapple with self-efficacy levels and confidence, then that's something we also have to keep in mind. How do we structure our sessions with students or our experiences with students so that we set them up for success? How do we make sure that, like, for instance, if we're developing a word work experience or a fluency practice, like we're creating opportunities for them to be successful and then to build. So for instance, in terms of fluency, a reader's theater experience might be appropriate, where the student, like you're scaffolding the student's first run of a passage, but then through ongoing practice and focusing on certain skills that they're developing in their practice of that reading, you're creating an authentic opportunity for them to really showcase the fluency skills that they've developed through a reader's theater experience or passage that's relevant or exciting to them. So again, surveys and interviews can be very helpful in addition to learning more about the student's experience, also the parents' experience, making sure that they're at the table when we're discussing ways to support individual learners. How, like, what are some of the things that students like to do when they go home? What are some of the shared family literacy experiences that they have when they're at home? For instance, maybe the family gathers around the TV and they watch the news together in a home language, and they have conversations about what's going on in the world and the implications that has for their household and their family. Those are literacy experiences. So as teachers who learn more about what's going on in the household, we can partner with parents and talk about ways to reinforce that. So if fluency is something students are working on, then we can invite them to maybe like show closed captioning, or if oral language fluency is something we're working on, we can invite the student to then summarize what they talked about in the home language in English, and to really practice using their language or speaking in different contexts, including in their household. So we can find different ways to co-construct these plans that reinforce the skills that students might be working on, perhaps in an RTI context or an MTSS context, if we learn more about those family literacy experiences that are already taking place in the household. So with that, again, we're exploring ways to utilize our knowledge of student social identities to learn more about areas of strength in relation to reading and literacy. So I'm wondering if there's any strategies or practices that you all have used or seen that maybe you want to share here. Again, no pressure, but just wanted to open up the floor.
I think family trips, cooking, they help so much, and like meeting with their friends, especially at home, it also helps so much.
Oh yes, building that community and developing that rapport with families. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that.
Some of the things that I do is during recess, some of the kids that I help, they like to run or play basketball. So I'll go out there with them.
Oh, nice.
And we'll do that.
Hire 3-pointers.
They're not as good as them. But when another thing I do with my kids is words that I know that they like. I have, so we do a program called SIPS. I don't know if you've heard of that. So I put their words in with the SIPS cards that they like, and we do word wars. And
Oh,
I
fun.
put the cards up, and whoever says the card first gets it. Unless they all say it in unison, then I get it. And
Oh, got
once
it.
they, whoever has the biggest stack gets a lollipop.
Oh.
And what I do is, if my stack is bigger than any of their stacks, they all get a lollipop. So it kind of helps create them to speak it in unison. But I noticed
Perfect.
when I started putting their words in with the words,
Mm.
my stack became 3 times bigger than any of their stacks. So they all felt really good because their words were in there too, and it gave them more confidence
Oh,
that
gotcha.
I was engaging in what they know.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, building that personal relevance can certainly, we could see a correlation between those two things. And so kind of to piggyback on that, if like they're like cognates that are part of students' home languages, we can include those cards as well. So again, like drawing from that student knowledge to enhance engagement can be certainly very powerful. Did anyone else want to share before I move? Okay, well, thank you both for sharing your views. So earlier we were talking about, yeah, like supporting students who we know need more help, and certainly screeners can be a very helpful tool in that respect as well. Like screener assessments are usually very like practical. So in terms of like the principles of assessment, practicality is usually quite strong because they're quite quick. It's usually like a 3-minute assessment that gives you a snapshot into what students know and maybe you need a little bit more help in, and they could break down some of the skills in reading. So for instance, knowing how many words a student can read per minute on a grade level passage can give us some insight, right? If we see that they're scoring in the like 10th percentile, then we can couple that with a diagnostic assessment, such as a phonics assessment, to see like, okay, what areas do I want to target? And so these norm referenced and criterion referenced assessments allow us to, kind of get a better sense of which students might need a little bit more support and in what particular areas. How do we target our learning and instruction based on that? Because the reading and literacy process is really quite multifaceted. If we have students that are a couple grade levels behind, like, well, why is that the case? In what way are they a couple grade levels behind? Do they need more support in phonological awareness, in vocabulary, in fluency, in certainly comprehension's at the heart of reading, right? Like the idea is for students to be able to access the author's intended message and to then critically evaluate that. But are there some other areas that we need to target to help them focus that cognitive energy on comprehension? So certainly creating using these formal and informal assessments that allow us to learn more about the students' understandings of literacy in relation to their personal identities and experiences allow us to really fine tune the targets and instructional strategies that we develop to support them and to then create even more challenging goals for them. So by progress monitoring, another form of assessment, we could see if some of the instructional practices we're using are working. So for instance, if fluency is something that we're trying to build through Reader's Theater, we can use progress monitoring to see if, okay, we're able to, for instance, see them read more words per minute. And again, tying that back to identity, if they're reading passages that are, again, like really decontextualized, they might, that might not necessarily reduce any concerns we have about motivation, or if they're feeling a lot of anxiety when it's time to, like put on the timer and show how many words they can read per minute, that might also impact the validity of our assessment. So if there are materials that we can, or passages we can use that reflect more meaningful topics for students, then that will also just give us a more accurate window into what they're like actually fully capable of. And so this idea of data-driven dialogue calls for that, right? Because when we're using assessment to get a better understanding of where students are and what they need more help in. We want those numbers or anecdotal records to accurately represent what students are capable of. So we want to make sure that we're not investing all of our instructional decisions in one assessment tool, because they're all going to have affordances as well as limitations. So we want to make sure that we're drawing from these multiple means of assessment to get a better understanding of what experiences are going to be meaningful and relevant to our students. So I just have here some examples of what that could look like and how you can use these different assessment results to kind of get a better understanding of where students might be. So I'll share all of these slides with you. There's also going to be some practice materials here if you're interested. I also have one more. Oh, I do have like one plug. So if you want to like learn more about assessment, I'm not assessment, rather, if you want to participate in a community of learners who are just committed to fostering reading and literacy, I want to just do a little plug here for the Orange County Reading Association. We're a group of like scholars and teachers and principals who really just like to engage in different literacy and reading work around the community. So I'll also include that here so that you could learn more about that. I'm going to share with you in the chat in a bit a survey, an exit survey that the program is asking or inviting you to complete. So I'll do that in a sec too. But I'll also stay on for a bit if there are any questions. But since we only have about 30 seconds left, I want to also formally thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing part of your Saturday with me today so that we could learn more about how to just explore the topic of building and fostering student engagement. Just the FYI, I'm going to go ahead and turn off or stop the recording right now.